One day, my son accidentally left his phone at my house. When a message from his wife came in, I picked up the phone and read it. What they were planning made me immediately call my lawyer with a revenge plan. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway, and I was 68 years old when my life changed in a single afternoon. Because of a forgotten phone and a message I was never supposed to read. Let me start from the beginning, because stories like mine don't begin with the dramatic moment. They begin quietly, in kitchens that smell like biscuits and coffee, in houses full of photographs, in years of ordinary love that you assume will always be returned. I had lived in the same house in Franklin, Tennessee for 31 years. My late husband, Robert, built the back porch with his own hands. We raised 2 children there, Daniel, our son, and Claire, our daughter. When Robert passed from a heart attack 6 years ago, I thought the hardest chapter of my life had already been written. I was wrong. Daniel was 42. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a silver Lexus, and had married Brittany 8 years before. A woman 10 years his junior with sharp cheekbones, sharper opinions, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I had tried in the beginning. Lord knows I tried. I brought casseroles to their house in Brentwood. I offered to babysit their 2 boys, Tyler and Mason. I bit my tongue at Christmas dinners when Brittany made comments about my cooking, my house, my way of doing things, but something had shifted in the last 2 years. The invitations to family dinners became rarer. Daniel's phone calls grew shorter, more formal, like he was speaking to a business acquaintance rather than his mother. When I asked if something was wrong, he always said the same thing. "Everything's fine, Mom. We're just busy." I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was Brittany's influence. Her family had never been close, and she had always seemed vaguely uncomfortable with how much Robert and I had given to our children. But I pushed the worry down. I watered my garden. I went to church on Sundays. I had lunch with my friend Dorothy every Tuesday at the Blue Moon Diner on Main Street. Then came the Thursday in April that changed everything. Daniel had stopped by that morning, briefly, unexpectedly, to drop off some papers related to my car insurance, which he had always helped me manage. He seemed distracted, checked his watch twice, and left within 20 minutes. I noticed his phone on the kitchen counter only after I heard his car pull out of the driveway. I picked it up to call him. I truly did. But before I could dial, the screen lit up in my hand with a message from Brittany. I still remember exactly what it said. I have replayed it in my mind hundreds of times since. Did she sign anything yet? We need to move on the account before the end of the month. If she won't cooperate, we'll go the other route. The attorney in Nashville said it's doable if we establish diminished capacity. She's old enough that nobody will question it. I stood in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I had made Daniel's birthday cakes for 42 years. And I read those words 3 times. Diminished capacity. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, to take control of my finances, to take the house, to take everything Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. My hands did not shake. I noticed that later, that my hands were completely still. But something inside me went very cold and very quiet, the way the air goes still just before a bad storm rolls in over the Tennessee hills. I set the phone back on the counter exactly where I had found it. I walked to the living room and sat in Robert's old armchair by the window. I looked out at the dogwood tree in the front yard, the one he had planted the year Daniel was born. And I thought, so this is what it's come to. Daniel came back for the phone 20 minutes later. He was apologetic, flustered. I handed it to him with a smile and said I hadn't noticed it until he knocked. He gave me a quick hug and left. I watched the silver Lexus disappear down the street. Then I went to my desk, opened my address book, and found the number for Howard Finch, the best estate attorney in Williamson County, and a man my husband had trusted for 20 years. I did not cry, not then. There would be time for grief later. Right now, I had work to do. I sat at that desk for a long time before I picked up the phone. The house was quiet around me. The particular quiet of a home that has known a family and now holds its memories like pressed flowers between pages. Robert's reading glasses were still on the shelf by the fireplace. I hadn't been able to move them. Now, looking at them, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not grief, but anger. A slow, clarifying anger that rose through me like heat. Who did they think I was? I was a woman who had nursed a dying husband through 18 months of heart disease without once falling apart in front of the children. A woman who had managed every bill, every tax return, every investment account since Robert's death. Not because I had to, but because I had always been the quiet competence behind this family. Robert had been the warmth. I had been the foundation. And now my own son and his wife thought they could whisper behind my back about diminished capacity? I pulled out a legal pad and a pen, and I began to write. First, I listed what I owned. The house in Franklin, paid off, worth somewhere between $580,000 and $640,000, according to recent neighborhood sales. The investment account Robert and I had built over decades, currently holding just over $410,000, a smaller savings account, a modest IRA, a life insurance policy with Daniel listed as the primary beneficiary, something I had set up years ago without a second thought. Then I listed what I stood to lose. If they succeeded, if a judge somewhere actually agreed that I lacked the mental capacity to manage my own affairs, a conservator would be appointed. In cases like that, family members often petition to serve as conservators themselves. Daniel would control my money. Brittany would be standing right behind him. I had seen enough news stories to know how these situations ended for elderly women living alone. The thought made me set down my pen and press my palms flat on the desk. Was I afraid? Yes. I will not pretend otherwise. Fear is not weakness. It is information. And the information my fear was giving me was simple. You are in danger, and no one is coming to help you unless you go find them. I thought about calling Claire. My daughter lived in Portland, Oregon, 3 time zones away, managing a landscape architecture firm and raising 2 girls with her husband, Pete. Claire and Daniel had never been particularly close, and Claire had said things about Brittany over the years that I had politely deflected. Claire would be furious. She would fly in. She would make noise. And noise, I decided, was not what I needed yet. Not yet. What I needed was strategy. I picked up the phone and called Howard Finch. Howard was 71, semi-retired, and had drawn up Robert's will 15 years ago. He was a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness and remained undisturbed by all of it. His assistant put me through to him directly, a small courtesy that I had always appreciated. "Margaret," he said, "it's been a while. How are you?" "I've been better, Howard," I said. "I need to see you as soon as possible. Something has come up that can't wait." There was a brief pause. Howard did not ask unnecessary questions. "Can you come in tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock? "I'll be there," I said. I spent that evening going through files. Robert had been meticulous, bless him, and every document I could possibly need was organized in the fireproof cabinet in the study. Bank statements, property deeds, investment records going back 15 years. I pulled everything relevant and made a neat stack. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I made myself a proper dinner, chicken soup from scratch, and I ate it at the kitchen table with the radio on. I needed to think clearly, and I could not think clearly on an empty stomach or a sleepless night. As I ate, the plan began to take shape. It wasn't a plan born of revenge. Not yet, anyway. It was a plan born of protection. My first instinct was simply to make sure that whatever Daniel and Brittany were scheming, they would find nothing to take. I needed to understand my legal options. I needed to know whether updating my will and restructuring my accounts could create a wall they could not breach. But somewhere between the soup and the silence, a second thought arrived, quiet and precise. Protection alone is not enough. If they are willing to do this once, they will try again. And that thought, small, cold, and perfectly clear, was the seed of everything that followed. I washed my bowl, dried it, and put it away. I set my alarm for 7. I laid out my clothes for the morning, my navy blazer, the one I wore to serious meetings, and I slept. Not well, but enough. Because tomorrow, I was going to see Howard Finch. And the next chapter of this story was going to be written on my terms. Howard Finch's office was on the second floor of a red brick building on 5th Avenue South, just off the square in downtown Franklin. I had been there twice before. Once when Robert and I updated our wills in 2009, and once when we set up the trust after his diagnosis. Both times, I had been sitting across from Howard as a wife, managing things together with my husband. This time, I sat alone. Howard listened without interruption as I told him everything. I described the message on Daniel's phone precisely, word for word. I had written it down that evening, verbatim, before the exact phrasing could soften in my memory. I told him about the gradual withdrawal, the shorter phone calls, the sense over the past 2 years that my son was being managed away from me. When I finished, Howard removed his glasses, cleaned them with the cloth he kept in his breast pocket, and put them back on. "Margaret," he said, "what you're describing is not uncommon. It has a name in elder law circles: predatory conservatorship. The strategy is typically this: establish a pattern of claimed confusion or incompetence, file a petition with the court, and have a family member appointed as guardian or conservator. Once that's in place, they control the finances." "Can they actually succeed?" I asked. "I am not confused. I manage my own accounts, I drive, I live independently." "That works in your favor," he said. "But you'd be surprised what a determined family member and a cooperative physician can accomplish if the groundwork is laid carefully. The phrase diminished capacity suggests they may already have spoken to someone." He paused. "Have you had any medical appointments recently where you felt the doctor was asking unusual questions?" I thought back. 3 months ago, Daniel had accompanied me to a routine cardiology follow-up, something he had volunteered to do, which had touched me at the time. The cardiologist had asked a standard cognition screening at the end of the appointment. I had answered perfectly, thought nothing of it. Now I thought a great deal of it. "I believe they may have already taken one step," I said. Howard nodded slowly. "All right, here's what we're going to do." The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the time I left, I had a clear picture of my options and a list of actions to take in a specific order. Howard would file paperwork to formalize my legal competency status. A preemptive measure, creating a documented record. I would update my will and restructure the beneficiary designations on my investment accounts and life insurance policy. I would also consult a separate physician, one of my own choosing, for a formal, independent cognitive evaluation. "Document everything," Howard told me as I stood to leave. "Every conversation with Daniel, every visit, every irregularity." I drove home with the windows down, even though the April air was still cool. I needed the wind. Over the following days, I noticed something I had expected, but still found remarkable. Daniel began calling more often, not warmly. The calls had a probing quality, a careful cheerfulness that felt rehearsed. He asked how I was feeling. He mentioned, twice, that Brittany was worried about me living alone. He suggested gently that perhaps we should update some of the paperwork on my accounts together to make things easier. I told him I felt wonderful. I told him not to worry. I told him I had just been to the doctor and everything was perfectly fine. The calls stopped after that, replaced by a silence that had an entirely different texture than before. This was not the silence of a busy son. This was the silence of people recalculating. Good, I thought. Let them recalculate. The documentary evidence arrived on a Friday morning, 10 days after my first meeting with Howard. Howard had, through proper legal channels and with my written authorization, requested a review of certain account activity related to a joint account Daniel and I had held for household emergencies. A small account, only a few $1,000s, but one that Daniel had co-signatory access to. The bank records showed 17 withdrawals over the previous 14 months, totaling just over $9,300. None of them had been discussed with me. None of them corresponded to any purpose I could identify. I sat at my kitchen table with the printed statements in front of me and looked at the dates and amounts, small enough to seem administrative, frequent enough to be deliberate. They had already started. I called Howard from the kitchen landline, the old one, mounted on the wall, the one Robert had insisted on keeping even after everyone else switched to cell phones. He had said, "There are times you'll want a phone that doesn't run out of battery, Margaret." He had been right about more things than I could count. "Howard," I said, "they've already been taking money." "I see the records," he said. "This changes things significantly. This is no longer just a preventive matter. This is documented financial exploitation of an elder. Are you prepared to move forward on all fronts?" I looked out the kitchen window at the dogwood tree. The white blooms were fully open now. "Yes," I said, "I'm entirely prepared." The first move was the cleanest. Howard filed the updated estate documents on a Monday morning. A revised will, restructured beneficiary designations, and a formal durable power of attorney naming Claire, not Daniel, as my legal representative in the event I became incapacitated. Claire did not yet know the full story. I had called her the previous week, told her only that I was updating my legal documents and wanted her to serve in that role, and asked her not to mention it to Daniel. Claire, who was sharper than anyone gave her credit for, had asked only one question. "Mom, is everything okay?" "It will be," I had said. The second move was to separate the emergency joint account, closing it, and transferring the remaining balance to a new account in my name only. Howard had also sent a formal letter, on firm letterhead, to Daniel's home address, notifying him that the joint account had been closed and that any further questions regarding my finances should be directed to Howard's office. That letter arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday evening, Brittany was in my driveway. I saw her car from the living room window before she knocked, a white Range Rover, parked at an angle that suggested she had not been particular about staying between the lines. She knocked 3 times, hard, not the soft knock of a visitor. I took a breath, smoothed my cardigan, and opened the door. She was dressed in tennis clothes, which meant she had come directly from wherever she had been when she saw the letter. Her expression was a performance of calm that she had not quite had time to fully prepare. "Margaret," she said, "we need to talk." "Come in," I said. She did not sit down. She stood in my living room, in the room where Daniel had taken his first steps, where Robert and I had spent 30 Christmases. And she spoke in the tone of someone who is accustomed to winning arguments before they have started. "I don't know what Howard Finch has been telling you," she said, "but what you're doing with these account changes is going to create a tax mess, and it's going to hurt the boys' financial future. Daniel and I have been planning—" "What have you been planning, Brittany?" I asked. She paused. Just a flicker. We've been planning to make sure you're protected. From what? Another pause, slightly longer. From making decisions that could be impulsive, emotional. You've been alone for 6 years, Margaret. We worry. I looked at her steadily. Do you? She switched approaches with the fluency of someone who practiced it. Her voice dropped. She became gentle, almost tender. We love you. Daniel is devastated that you went to an attorney without talking to him. He feels like you don't trust him. Tell Daniel, I said evenly, that I will be happy to speak with him directly. But my legal and financial decisions are my own. They always have been, and they will remain so. Brittany's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret, you really should think about what you're doing. There are people who will take advantage of a woman in your position. I'm aware, I said. I'm taking precautions against exactly that. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. She left without touching the tea I had offered, and not expected her to accept. Daniel came 2 days later. This visit was different. He was not cold or performative. He was distressed, genuinely, in the way I remembered from when he was a boy, and knew he had done something wrong. He sat at my kitchen table and told me I was being paranoid. He told me Howard Finch was taking advantage of a grieving widow. He told me that everything he and Brittany had discussed was only for my own good. Daniel, I said quietly, the joint account. 14 months, $9,300. Do you want to tell me where that money went? The color left his face. He said it was for various things, emergencies, expenses related to my household that he had managed on my behalf. He would get me documentation. Howard will be in touch, I said. He'll need that documentation as well. Daniel left without finishing his coffee. I stood at the window and watched him go, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Grief. Not fear, not triumph. Grief. Quiet and old. For the son I thought I had raised, and the man sitting across from me in my kitchen. I gave myself 3 days. I drove up to Natchez Trace Parkway on a Thursday morning and walked one of the long trail sections alone among the old trees and the birdsong, and I let myself cry. Not for long, but enough. I ate dinner at a small restaurant in a town I had never visited. I slept in a bed and breakfast with yellow curtains and the sound of rain on the roof. I called Claire and talked for an hour without mentioning any of this, just catching up, listening to her daughters argue in the background, laughing at nothing important. By Sunday afternoon, I was back in Franklin, rested, clear, ready. The gift arrived on a Tuesday. A beautiful arrangement of white peonies in a tall glass vase, with a card in Brittany's handwriting. Thinking of you. We only want what's best for your family. Daniel and Brittany. I put the flowers on the kitchen counter, where they were genuinely lovely, and I felt precisely nothing about the gesture. This, I recognized, was what the 3 days of rest had given me. Not hardness. I was not a hard woman, and I did not wish to become one. But clarity. The clarity that comes when you have made a decision so fully and firmly that there is no longer any internal argument to be had. The flowers were beautiful. They were also a bribe. Both things were true, and neither one moved me. Brittany called the following morning. She was warm, solicitous, a version of herself I had rarely encountered. She hoped I had received the flowers. She hoped I was feeling well. She said, almost in passing, that Daniel had spoken with a financial advisor, a very good one, in Nashville, and that perhaps we could all sit down together, the 4 of us, and discuss things in a positive, collaborative way. No attorneys, no formality, just family. I appreciate the thought, Brittany, I said, but any discussion about my finances will include Howard. That's not negotiable. A brief silence. Then, smoothly, Of course, whatever makes you comfortable. I said I would have Howard's office reach out to schedule something, and ended the call. I stood in the kitchen for a moment afterward, the phone in my hand, and I thought about how different this conversation would have been 6 weeks ago. Before the forgotten phone, before Howard's office, before the bank statements. 6 weeks ago, I might have been touched by the peonies. I might have felt the old hope that things were getting better. I might have accepted the invitation to a family dinner and let my guard down over a glass of sweet tea, only to find later that something had been slipped in front of me to sign. The thought was not paranoia. The bank records had already taught me who I was dealing with. I called Dorothy. Dorothy Marsh had been my closest friend for 22 years. We had met in a church choir, discovered we shared a love of Georgia O'Keeffe and an impatience with slow drivers, and had been having Tuesday lunches ever since. Dorothy was 70, sharp as a tack, and had survived her own unpleasant divorce from a man who had tried to hide assets in 3 different states. She knew how the powerful attempted to make themselves untouchable. We met at the Blue Moon that afternoon. I told her everything, quietly, over chicken salad and sweet tea. Dorothy listened the way she always listened, fully, without interrupting, her eyes steady and warm. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You've done everything right," she said. "Howard Finch is the best man for this. The independent cognitive evaluation was brilliant. That takes the weapon right out of their hands." "I keep wondering," I said, "if there's something I missed. Something they still have that I don't know about." "There may be," Dorothy said honestly, "but you've closed the main doors. Now we watch for the windows." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "You are not alone in this, Margaret. Not for 1 minute. I found myself blinking more than necessary and had to look out the diner window for a moment. The square was bright in the afternoon light. That Sunday, I went to speak privately with Pastor Glenn Hayes after service. Glenn had known me and Robert for 20 years. He was not a man who offered empty comfort. He was practical, grounded, the kind of pastor who showed up with tools when your roof leaked and made sure the widows in his congregation had functioning furnaces before winter. I valued his counsel. I did not tell him every detail, but I told him enough: that I was in a legal dispute with family, that I needed to hold steady, that I occasionally felt afraid. He listened, and then he said, "Margaret, what you're describing takes courage. Don't mistake clarity for coldness. What you're doing is right, and being right is sometimes lonely work." I drove home with the windows down again, the warm Tennessee air moving through the car, and I felt not happy, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Supported, accompanied. Less alone than I had felt standing in my kitchen reading those words on a phone that didn't belong to me. The flowers were still on the counter when I came in, still lovely. I put them in the trash that evening. They came on a Saturday afternoon together at a time they had not called ahead to arrange. I was in the garden when I heard the car, the silver Lexus pulling up the drive and the white Range Rover behind it. 2 cars. I noticed that detail, and I noticed what it meant. They had planned this as a coordinated effort. This was not a spontaneous visit. I set down my trowel slowly, brushed the soil from my knees, and allowed myself one quiet moment before I put on the face I intended to wear for the next hour. It was not a mask. It was simply composure, the kind you earn rather than perform. I took off my gardening gloves and walked to the porch to meet them. Brittany was wearing a soft blouse, a deliberately approachable choice. Daniel carried a bakery box. "A peach pie," he said, from the shop in Leiper's Fork that I had always liked. Small calibrations. They had prepared. "We wanted to come by," Daniel said, "because we miss you. We've been worried. We haven't handled things well, and we want to make it right." I invited them in. I made coffee. I allowed the performance its opening. We sat in the living room for 20 minutes in a version of normality. Pie was served, the boys were mentioned. Something was said about Tyler's baseball team. Brittany asked about my garden. I answered pleasantly. Daniel talked about a property he was selling in Williamson County. And then Brittany set down her cup and shifted forward slightly, the way people do when they are transitioning from small talk to the real purpose. "Margaret," she said, "we're here because we love you and we're scared for you. Howard Finch is a lovely man, but he's an estate attorney, and estate attorneys have a financial incentive to complicate things. What he's been steering you toward, all this restructuring, the new will, the power of attorney, it creates tax liabilities you may not understand. It isolates you from the people who love you most." She paused. "We're asking you to pause. Just pause. Let us bring in our financial advisor, a neutral party, and review everything together as a family. What you've done isn't irreversible yet." I let the word "yet" sit in the air between us. "And if I don't pause?" I asked. Brittany's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. "Then I think things are going to become very difficult, Margaret, for everyone involved, including you. Legal processes are expensive, they're exhausting, they're public. Do you really want people in this community reading about a dispute between you and your son?" There it was, the threat that had been folded inside the pie box all along. I noticed, not for the first time, how skilled Brittany was at making aggression sound like concern. Every sentence she had spoken since walking through my door had been engineered to position me as fragile, impulsive, and in need of management. It was, I realized, the same dynamic that had been building for years, just now stripped of its usual patience and moved into the open. The fact that she felt bold enough to do it in my own living room told me something significant. She had expected today to work. She had expected me to waver. I looked at my son. Daniel was looking at his pie. "Daniel," I said quietly, "look at me." He looked up. He was 42 years old, and he looked, in that moment, very much like the teenager who had once backed the car into the garage door and spent 3 days trying to find a way not to tell his father. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "Mom, nobody's threatening. I want to hear it from you, not from Brittany, from you." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "We're just saying that this can get complicated, for all of us." "I know it can," I said. "I'm prepared for that." I stood up. I was not angry, or rather I was angry, but the anger was controlled, directed, precise. "I want you both to understand something clearly. I am in excellent health. I am in full possession of my faculties, a fact that is now formally documented by 2 independent physicians. I have an attorney who has reviewed my accounts, and I have reported the unexplained withdrawals from the joint account to the appropriate authorities." I paused to let that land. "The conversation you wanted to have today, the one where I agree to pause and reassess and perhaps sign something in a family meeting with no attorneys present, that conversation is not going to happen. It was never going to happen." The color in Brittany's face was interesting. She had come in practiced and smooth, and now the practice was visibly slipping. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said. "I don't believe I am." They left. The pie sat on the table, barely touched. I noticed that Daniel had not looked back at me as he walked down the porch steps. Not once. I wasn't sure whether that meant shame or something harder than shame. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps he was simply a man who had made choices he could no longer look his mother in the eye over, and he knew it, and the knowing was its own particular punishment. I locked the door behind them, walked back to the living room, and sat in Robert's chair. And then, For the first time since this had started, I felt fear. Genuine, physical fear. The kind that settles in the chest and makes the room feel smaller. Because they had said public. They had said difficult. They had not been bluffing about their willingness to escalate. But as I sat there, something shifted. The fear was real, and so was what lay underneath it. They are afraid of what I've already done. People don't threaten you for past actions. They threaten you for the ones they believe you're still capable of taking. I reached for my phone and texted Howard. They came today. I'll call Monday with the details. We are on the right track. Then I went back to my garden. There was still an hour of good light left. Howard had asked for 3 weeks to complete the final preparations, and I had given him those 3 weeks without interference. I tended my garden. I had my Tuesday lunches with Dorothy. I went to church. I began, quietly, privately, reading about elder financial abuse cases and what outcomes had looked like for families that had gone the distance. What I read did not comfort me, but it did inform me. And information I had learned was the only armor that actually held. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late May. Howard's office. Both parties with representation. Daniel had hired an attorney, a younger man named Greg Barfield, who worked in a large Nashville firm and had the confident, slightly preemptive manner of someone accustomed to representing people who expected to get what they wanted. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always do. I wore the navy blazer, the same one I had laid out the night before my first meeting with Howard, all those weeks ago. I had pressed it the evening before. Small rituals matter. They remind you of your own seriousness. Howard was already there. Across the table, Daniel and Greg Barfield. Brittany was not listed on the meeting agenda, but she arrived with Daniel, and Greg Barfield made a small effort to seat her that Howard blocked politely, but firmly. "This meeting is between the parties specified in the notice," he said. "Mrs. Brittany Calloway is welcome to wait in the reception area." Brittany's face suggested she had not anticipated this. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Greg. Greg gave a small, practiced shrug that said this was a minor point not worth contesting. Brittany sat down in the reception area with the expression of someone filing notes for future grievances. We began. Howard is not a dramatic man. He does not raise his voice. He does not use the kind of language that belongs in courtroom television. He presents facts in a tone of measured, unhurried clarity that I had always found quietly devastating when aimed at the opposing side. He presented the bank records, all 17 withdrawals, dated and itemized. He presented the letter Daniel had not yet provided explaining what the money had been used for, the one Daniel had promised in my kitchen, and which had never arrived. He presented the transcript of the message Brittany had sent to Daniel's phone, the message I had transcribed verbatim the night I read it, and which Howard had attached to a formal affidavit I had signed. He presented the name of the attorney in Nashville that Brittany had referenced in that message. Howard had, through proper channels, confirmed that a preliminary consultation regarding a conservatorship petition had in fact taken place. He presented the documentation of Daniel's accompaniment to my cardiology appointment and the timing of the cognitive screening, and the fact that a copy of that screening had been requested without my knowledge or consent by a third party whose request the practice had, thank God, declined to fulfill. And then Howard presented the independent cognitive evaluations, 2 of them from 2 separate physicians, both concluding in unambiguous clinical language that Margaret Ellen Calloway was in complete possession of her cognitive faculties and showed no indicators whatsoever of diminished capacity. Greg Barfield had been taking notes throughout. At some point, his pen had stopped moving. I watched that happen. The pen simply went still on the pad, mid-sentence, and he did not seem to notice. I thought, that is the moment he understood the position his client is actually in. Daniel was very still. He was looking at the table. "These actions," Howard said with the same unhurried calm, "constitute, at minimum, financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder under Tennessee statute. The unauthorized withdrawals alone meet the threshold for criminal referral. The attempted conservatorship proceedings, preliminary though they were, demonstrate premeditation and intent." There was a long silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that lands differently on different people in the room. On Howard, it was professional and expected. On Greg Barfield, it was the silence of reassessment. On Daniel, it was something else entirely. Greg Barfield began to speak. He used words like context and misunderstanding and family stress. He suggested that emotions had run high and that reasonable people might see the account activity differently, and that his client had always had his mother's best interests. "Mr. Barfield," Howard said pleasantly, "we are not here to negotiate my client's best interests. We are here to determine what restitution and legal remedies are appropriate." From the reception area, I heard Brittany say something sharp to the administrative assistant. The walls were not especially thick. I wondered what she was thinking, out there in that waiting room chair, cut out of the meeting she had orchestrated. I wondered whether it had yet occurred to her that the entire architecture of the plan she had built, carefully over months and years, had been documented, turned around, and handed back to her as evidence. I looked at Daniel. My son. The baby I had held in a hospital in Franklin 42 years ago, red-faced and furious, and wholly himself. The boy who had slept with a stuffed bear until he was 11 and had cried at Robert's funeral with his face turned away, thinking I couldn't see. "Daniel," I said. He looked up. "I don't want your destruction," I told him. "I never did. But I will not allow this to continue." Something moved across his face. Complicated, old, and too late. Howard handed Greg Barfield the settlement proposal. Greg Barfield requested a 2-week recess to review the settlement proposal with his client. Howard granted 10 days. On the 8th day, Greg Barfield called Howard's office and informed him that his client wished to negotiate. Howard called me that afternoon to relay this information. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang, standing at the counter where the peonies had once sat in their tall glass vase. "What would you like to do?" Howard asked. I had been thinking about this moment for several weeks. I had imagined different versions of it. A version in which I felt triumphant. A version in which I felt sad. A version in which I made some room for reconciliation. I had sat with all of those possibilities honestly and let myself consider each one. "The terms stand," I said. "There is nothing to negotiate." The settlement I had authorized Howard to present was not punitive beyond what was necessary. It required full repayment of the $9,300 in documented unauthorized withdrawals, plus interest. A formal signed release in which Daniel acknowledged that no grounds existed for a conservatorship petition and waived any future right to initiate one on the basis of the circumstances previously discussed. Removal of Daniel as primary beneficiary from my life insurance policy, replaced by Claire and a charitable foundation Robert had supported. A formal legal agreement that any future questions about my estate would be directed exclusively through Howard's office. It also included a private letter, not a legal document, not filed anywhere, that I had written to Daniel myself. I had not told Howard about this letter until I handed it to him sealed. It said what needed to be said between a mother and a son, in language that belonged to us and to no court. I had written it at Robert's desk, in the study at 10 o'clock at night, and I had cried while writing it. The first time I had cried through this entire ordeal, and the last. Not from weakness. From the understanding that grief and resolve can exist at the same time, that loving someone and refusing to be destroyed by them are not contradictions. What the letter said is between Daniel and me. The agreement was signed on a Friday morning. Daniel came alone. Without Brittany. Without Greg Barfield at his elbow. Howard witnessed the signature. I sat across the table and said nothing until it was done. When Daniel stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Mom," he started. "I know," I said. "Go home, Daniel." He went. The legal matter was closed. The estate was secured. My will had been finalized in the form I had chosen. The house and the majority of the investment accounts to be held in trust, with Claire as trustee, and specific provisions for the grandchildren, including Tyler and Mason, that bypass their parents entirely and would not become accessible until both boys reached adulthood. Brittany would never touch a single dollar of what Robert and I had built. The cardiologist's office, the one Daniel had accompanied me to, received a formal letter from Howard informing them that any future requests for my records required my direct, written, witnessed consent. The Nashville attorney who had been consulted about the conservatorship petition received a separate letter. Howard knew how to use letters. 3 weeks after the signing, a detective with the Williamson County Sheriff's Office called to inform me that the financial exploitation report Howard had filed had been reviewed and that the documented withdrawals met the threshold for a formal investigation. I was asked whether I wished to cooperate with a criminal prosecution. I thought about it for 24 hours. I sat on the back porch both evenings and looked at the yard, and I thought about Daniel's face when he had walked out of Howard's office. I thought about Tyler and Mason. I thought about every woman who had sat in a house like mine and had no Howard, no Dorothy, no organized cabinet of records. Women who had signed things they did not understand, or failed to realize what was happening until it was far too late to stop it. Then I called Howard and told him I would cooperate fully. I want to be clear about why. Not because I wanted Daniel in handcuffs, not out of spite, but because what had been done to me was done to a great many women in a great many quiet houses, and most of them never had a Howard Finch or a Dorothy or a Roberts old filing cabinet full of organized records. The only way to protect those women was to ensure that the people who preyed on them understood there were real consequences. The investigation resulted ultimately in a plea agreement. Not prison, but a significant financial penalty, a criminal record, and terms that would follow Daniel Calloway for a very long time. Brittany filed for divorce 4 months later. I learned this from Claire, who had learned it from a mutual acquaintance, and my reaction was the same plain, quiet thought I'd had standing in my kitchen on that April afternoon with someone else's phone in my hands. So this is what it's come to. Some endings announce themselves loudly. Others arrive without ceremony, settling into their proper shape the way furniture settles when a house finds its foundation. My house was still standing. The summer after everything was settled, I took a trip I had been postponing for 15 years. Robert and I had always talked about Ireland. His grandparents had been from County Clare, and there was a churchyard somewhere on the western coast where names in his family were carved into stones that had stood since the 1800s. We had always said, next year. And next year had kept arriving and departing without us on a plane. I went alone. 14 days. A rental car with the wheel on the wrong side. Roads barely wider than a footpath winding through green hills that looked exactly like the postcards, and somehow nothing like them. I found the churchyard on the 3rd day of driving, after 2 wrong turns and 1 very patient farmer who pointed me down a lane I would never have found on my own. I stood in the rain next to stones with the right names on them, And I spoke to Robert in the way you speak to people who aren't there anymore, but are still, in some elemental sense, present. I handled it, I told him. You would have been pleased with Howard. I stayed an extra 3 days. I ate fresh soda bread in a pub where nobody knew my name or my story. I walked along the cliffs of Mohair in the wind and felt, for the first time in longer than I could precisely remember, completely and simply free. Not free from grief. Grief does not leave, it only changes shape. But free from the particular exhaustion of being on guard, of watching for the next move, of carrying a weight that had never been mine to carry in the first place. When I came home, Claire was there. She had driven down from Portland with her daughters, Lily, who was 11, and Nora, who was 8, and had stocked my kitchen and was growing what appeared to be a very ambitious herb garden in my backyard beds. I took some liberties, she said, when I stood at the kitchen door looking at the lavender and rosemary. Don't stop, I said. We stood there together in the late afternoon sun, and Claire put her arm through mine the way she used to when she was small, and I thought, this is what I protected. This right here. That autumn was the best autumn I could remember in years. Claire came 3 times. Lily began calling me every Sunday evening to tell me about her week, with the particular seriousness of an 11-year-old who has decided you are worth her full attention. Nora sent drawings, elaborate, slightly surreal scenes involving animals in human clothing, which I began framing and hanging in the hallway. By November, the hallway looked like the illustrated wall of a very cheerful and slightly eccentric museum, and I loved it completely. Dorothy and I kept our Tuesday lunches and added Thursday evening walks around the park when the weather permitted. Pastor Hayes started a small scripture study group on Wednesday evenings that I attended not entirely for scriptural reasons. It was good company, good conversation, and Glenn made excellent coffee. I rejoined the Franklin Garden Club, from which I had quietly drifted in the difficult years. Several women welcomed me back with the warm, uncomplicated warmth of people who had simply missed your presence and said so plainly. I had forgotten how restorative that kind of simplicity could be, to be among people who wanted nothing from you except your company. I began, tentatively, writing down the story of what had happened, not for publication, not yet, but because writing has always helped me understand things that are otherwise too large to hold in the mind all at once. The pages accumulated slowly, in longhand, in a notebook I kept in Robert's desk drawer. As for Daniel, I knew through Claire and through the occasional quiet report from Howard what his situation had become. The plea agreement had required him to disclose the criminal record in professional licensing applications. His real estate career contracted significantly. Not collapsed entirely, but reduced to a shadow of what it had been. He had lost the house in Brentwood when the finances unraveled. He was renting an apartment in Murfreesboro. Tyler and Mason were with him half the time, under a custody arrangement Brittany had contested vigorously and lost on several points. The boys were, by all accounts, adjusting. Children are more resilient than adults deserve sometimes. I thought about them often. More than I thought about Daniel, if I am honest, and more than I thought about Brittany. I had written both boys' letters, brief, warm, entirely free of the adult conflict, and had sent birthday gifts and cards at the appropriate times. Whether their father passed any of this along, I couldn't know. But I had made the effort, and would continue to, because they were Robert's grandsons, and they had done nothing wrong, and they deserved at least one person in their lives who held that fact plainly and acted on it. Brittany had moved back to her hometown in Georgia. I did not know the details of her situation and did not seek them out. What I knew was this: The plan she had spent years carefully constructing. The house in Franklin, the investment accounts, the comfortable trajectory of inheriting a widow's assets while the widow was still alive, had come to nothing. Every move she had made had been documented, formally challenged, and ultimately turned against her. The life she had been maneuvering toward did not exist. I wondered occasionally whether she understood yet how much of her own time and energy she had spent building toward something that was never going to be allowed to happen. I hoped, in whatever small way was available to me, that she would eventually find a life that was genuinely her own, one that didn't require taking from anyone else to sustain it. I did not feel satisfaction at any of this in the sharp way I might have expected. What I felt was something closer to relief, and underneath that, a tiredness. The tiredness of someone who has carried a heavy thing for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. On a Sunday evening in November, I sat on Robert's back porch in the cool dark, a glass of wine on the armrest, the lights of the neighborhood coming on one by one in the early dusk. The dogwood was bare now, its branches making their particular winter pattern against the sky. From inside the house, I could hear Nora laughing at something on the television. Claire had stayed an extra 2 days, and the house had the full, warm noise of people in it again. I thought, this house is mine. It will remain mine. And when I am gone, it will go where I chose to send it. That thought, simple, plain, entirely ordinary, felt like the greatest luxury I had ever known. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is more than one, the first and most important is this: knowing your own mind is not vanity. It is armor. I survived what happened to me not because I was exceptional, but because I paid attention, I moved quickly, and I refused to let love be used as a lever against my own judgment. Know where your documents are. Know what you own. Have an attorney you trust before you need one desperately. And if someone you love begins to make you feel confused about your own clarity, pay attention to that feeling. It is telling you something true. To every woman sitting quietly in a house full of memories, wondering if she is overreacting, wondering if she is being unfair, you are probably not overreacting. And fairness begins with being fair to yourself. What would you have done if you had picked up that phone? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below. Your story may matter more than you think. And if this one found you at the right moment, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves out there.